This is JC Setting the Record Straight podcast. I'm your host, JC. On this channel, we set the record straight. That means we fact check and correct commonly believed misinformation and propaganda. You all are probably aware of a cause of action called wrongful death. It's basically the civil equivalent to murder or some type of homicide. The surviving family can hold the person liable for killing their loved one. Now, you all are probably aware of the O.J. Simpson case where he was acquitted in the murder case, but then he was found liable for wrongful death. So, in addition to wrongful death, there are cause of actions for wrongful life and wrongful birth. So, just to clarify the difference, wrongful birth is when the parents sue medical professionals for failing to discover birth defects because it's basically but for causation, right? But for the fact that they failed to discover the birth defects, the parents would have terminated the pregnancy. So therefore, the birth is wrongful, right? And then wrongful life is when the child sues the parent. Basically because the parents had a duty to terminate the pregnancy upon discovering birth defects, but they decided to have the child anyway. So now the child is here and he or she is unable to provide for his or her basic maintenance due to some physical or mental impairment. So that is the law as it stands now. Wrongful life. Well, okay, so I think what we're really talking about right now is wrongful birth because there are a lot of states that are trying to ban wrongful birth based on public policy reasons. I think Texas was trying to do that and a couple of other states. So anyway, I was just on someone's panel discussion and I was talking about wrongful life. And what I was trying to convey to him is that there are certain situations where someone has a duty to abort or terminate the pregnancy. So wrongful birth and wrongful life are both negligence-based torts. So the elements for negligence are a duty, a breach, causation, and damages. So parents or potential parents owe a duty of care to their potential offspring. They breach it by, discovering birth defects and having a child anyway, or because they decided to have the child and then the child felt that they were wrong by being brought into existence without their consent. As a result, the child suffers or, is unable to provide for himself, and so then there's damages. So what I was trying to talk about on that panel was this case, or a case that I thought was real, that was circulating around on TikTok. So I'm going to play the clip and then I'm going to come back with my commentary.
A few months ago, I took my parents to court for having me without my permission, and I won, so the court ordered them to give me $5,000 a month to cover my basic living expenses. Well, they went and had that appealed. So now they don't have to give me any money, and I have to go get a job. And I'm realizing, I don't have any work experience or any higher education. Nowhere's paying me $5,000 a month. So how the hell am I supposed to be able to afford my bills? What? Don't have children if you don't want to support them.
So everyone was talking about how spoiled and entitled this woman is. But the fact is, she did not consent to being brought into existence. Now she's going to be a wage slave. She's going to have to work and provide for herself. So there is an argument to be made that if you didn't consent to being here, that's not your fault. That was caused by your parents. So there are some people who feel that parents should have to provide for their children even into adulthood. So basically they were asking me to provide the case, and so I started looking it up and I couldn't find the case. It turns out that this is not real. This was a skit. I'm assuming that she's an anti-natalist and she was trying to get attention for that. There actually was a real case. Someone in India filed a lawsuit against his parents. He was a law student. The case was ultimately dismissed. But the fact remains is that there is a push to try to make this a reality, that they want children to be able to sue their parents for imposing life on them without their consent. Um, I know some people would say it doesn't make sense because consent is impossible. But just because consent is impossible, that doesn't mean that you get to violate someone's rights or impose something on them that they didn't consent to. So if a woman was unconscious, that doesn't mean because she's incapable of giving consent that you should go ahead and have sex with her. The person has been wronged and they should be entitled to damages. Now, this is not a reality though. I don't think that people are actually trying to get money from their parents. What they're trying to do is bring awareness to antinatalism so that people will be more conscientious before procreating. So I'm reading from a Drake Law Review article. It's called Wrongful Life: The Implications of Suits and Wrongful Life Brought by Children Against Their Parents. Now, this article was published in 1981, so obviously the law isn't current. But it does address the legal duty to abort. It says most courts have dismissed alleged wrongful life actions brought by infant plaintiffs on the ground that birth is not a legal injury. The tort of wrongful life is essentially an allegation that due to the negligence of another, birth occurred. The primary reason stated by courts in refusing to allow infants to recover damages for their alleged wrongful life is the public policy which values life over non-life. A secondary consideration is the difficulty in measuring damages when the calculation is to be made in the difference between non-life and life in an impaired state. So it talks about a New York case where the Court of Appeals the case is called Becker versus Schwartz. The Court of Appeals refused to recognize a cause of action for wrongful life for a child who was brain damaged and retarded as a result of her birth with Down syndrome. It says that the doctors failed to advise the mother of an increased risk of Down syndrome in children born to women over 35. So they're really just talking about wrongful birth, but not wrongful life. I guess some jurisdictions kind of merge the two, and it's all called wrongful life. But I think recent cases do make a distinction between wrongful birth and wrongful life. So another New York case resulted in a dismissal, and then they ruled that the answer to the question of whether it is better never to have born than to have been born with gross deficiencies, and the determination of the point at which deficiencies were so severe that non-life was preferable to life were beyond the competence of the courts. A New Jersey court ruled that life, whether or not physically impaired, is more valuable than non-life. I think that's so arbitrary. So you're physically impaired and you can't provide for yourself. You can't provide for your basic maintenance. So there's this presumption that life is sacred, life is a gift. So on one hand, they're saying that it's beyond the competence of the courts to determine whether non-life is better than life, but then they are making that assessment. They're saying, they're overwhelmingly pro-life. And I think it's deeply rooted in these Judeo-Christian belief systems. So there was a case in the California Courts of Appeals called Kurlander versus Bioscience Laboratories. In that case, the court recognized wrongful life for an infant born with Tay-Sachs disease. It says that the medical laboratories were alleged to have negligently performed tests on plaintiff's parents, which would have revealed plaintiff's parent status as carriers of the disease. As a result of defendant's negligence, inaccurate information was disseminated to her parents, which resulted in either a decision to conceive the plaintiff or in a failure to submit to amniocentesis and to subsequently abort her. As a result of her birth with Tay-Sachs, the plaintiff was mentally retarded and was subject to convulsions, loss of motor control, and various other physical disabilities. The court held that the reality of wrongful life is that a child both exists and suffers as a result of the negligence of others, and the fact that the birth and injury come hand in hand should not cause a court to deny recovery. The court subsequently found the plaintiff entitled to recover damages for the pain and suffering to be endured during the child's limited life span and any special pecuniary loss resulting from the impaired condition. Pecuniary just means economic damages. So the author of this law review article is arguing that by recognizing wrongful life or wrongful birth, they're really talking about wrongful life, but I think, again, this is an outdated case or law review. The author is saying that by allowing a child to sue his or her mother for giving birth to him or her is in effect creating a legal duty to abort. So she's basically saying that this goes against public policy. She's using the whole Roe v. Wade thing about the right to privacy, that the state should not intrude into a woman's right to procreate or have children. I don't necessarily agree with it. What she's trying to say is that there's state action involved. That when the child sues the parent, the state is basically acting on behalf of the plaintiff and intruding on a woman's right to procreate. But I don't think there actually is a state action involved in this. This is a private lawsuit, so the state is not intruding on anyone's right to procreate. It says, allowing a child to state a cause of action for wrongful life against her mother contemplates state intervention in the abortion decision at all phases of the pregnancy and for none of the heretofore judicially acknowledged compelling state interests for interfering with that decision. The justification for the recognition of a cause of action for wrongful life and its statement by the child against his mother would probably be premised on a state interest either in the termination of genetically impaired life or a state interest in providing a remedy for every wrong. I don't think that the state is providing a remedy, right? Because this isn't codified. This is a negligence-based tort, so it's common law. Okay, so I know this isn't completely related, but I want to address this because under the First Amendment, you have a right to petition, right? So a lot of people think that only means to political protest, but you actually have a right to petition all three branches of government, including the courts. So by filing lawsuits, you are exercising your First Amendment right to petition the courts. The purpose of allowing people to resolve their grievances through legal action is to prevent violence, right? Because back in the day, without courts, you would just have a gunfight or have war, whatever, But just because you file a private lawsuit, that doesn't mean that there's state action involved. There has to be a state actor. Without state action, the Constitution doesn't apply. This Constitution only applies to, government action. The only exception to this is the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment abolishing slavery can be applied to private actors. But I don't understand her argument, because if the parent who imposed life on this child without his or her consent, despite having significant birth defects, who's going to be responsible for the maintenance of that child? Because if the parents, I mean, the parents are going to die at some point, right? And so if the child outlives the parents, that child is not going to provide for himself or herself throughout the duration of his or her life. So I don't understand why that burden should be placed on society. You should be liable for the maintenance of that child, even once the child reaches the age of majority. If you cannot provide for said child, then you should have a duty to terminate the pregnancy. This is not a constitutional issue. In any event, I probably will do more content on wrongful life lawsuits. This law review, again, was published in 1981, so the case law is probably outdated. And like I said, states are trying to ban cause of actions for wrongful life and wrongful birth. But I'm just going to give my opinion on the subject. I think parents should be responsible for their children throughout their entire lives, not just to the age of 18. I think that just providing, support for them throughout the age of 18, that's not sufficient. I think that you should provide means for that child to provide for himself or herself, and that's the way it used to be under common law. Usually the parents would have a trade that they could pass down. They would have property. They married off their daughters and paid dowries. So, I mean, and this law review was talking about how there under common law there was never a recognized duty to abort. Right, there wasn't a duty to abort, but there was a duty to provide for your children. Parents were supposed to see to it that their children were able to provide for themselves. Parents didn't just leave it on their children to figure it out on their own. And a lot of times you knew the trade that the family was involved in based on the last name. So if you were a blacksmith, your last name would be Smith. And many other cultures see it this way, especially Asians. They do have a family business that they pass down to their children. They do sacrifice and make decisions together to decide what the child is going to do. I remember when I was taking accounting courses, it was nothing but Asian children and Asian students, and their parents already decided for them that they were going to be accountants, and they had jobs lined up for them when they graduated. Even when I was in law school, those parents already had jobs lined up for their children at law firms. So, by not holding parents liable, we are in effect holding the public accountable. Members of the public are being forced to provide for other people's children or their negligence. That should be against public policy. Thanks for your support. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to hit the notification bell so that you will know when I upload new content.